This is the interview with Bijoy Jain from Studio Mumbai. We are very happy we can do this interview, so thank you very much. I wanted to begin with the beginning and ask you how it all started, if there was an epiphany which brought you to architecture.
Not really, actually. My parents are doctors, and what I didn't want to be was in medicine, and this is something I stumbled into, but actually quite naturally. So there wasn't any sort of important moment, but I guess once I was in architecture school, it just sort of naturally unfolded from there for me. And what was nice is there were no reading books in the way that you'd read chemistry and physics and all of that, but it was exciting just being able to build models and do things with your hands, and so that's really how the whole process unfolded from there.
And who were your main influences? I mean, you worked in Los Angeles with Richard Meier from 89 to 91, so I suppose he was an influence. I was very curious what you learned from him and who were your other main influences, and if there were also Indian influences besides the Western architects.
I think the single most important person for me was my teacher, Robert Mangurian, who has a studio called Studio Works in Los Angeles. And I think he was really critical in shaping the way I think and see things. And what was interesting was really just this whole idea of the act of observation that he sort of imbibed. Richard Meier was more of a place of where I actually worked in the model shop. And through that process of doing very intricate models for the Getty Museum, that was really a sort of big learning curve for me. So more than in terms of the architecture was really the process. In India, there wasn't really any specific architect, but more just the sort of landscape and some of the old traditional buildings that you see, because most of the country's built really without architects. But to observe the sort of nuances that are sort of embedded in these buildings, for me was really, inspiring. Another important part was that we have a great history or culture of building, which I think over time now has been diluted. So it's this idea of, the act of building very meticulously that, was what interests me in India, actually.
And what did you learn from Mangurian? Can you tell me?
A lot of things. I think first and foremost was just this idea of being able to see things, not necessarily what is directly in front of you, but the sort of more subtle aspects. So that was something he quite rigorously looked at, and also just the way he saw things. For me, that was quite interesting. His way of making things from models to photographs, and I think most critically was his idea of being disciplined, of practicing architecture every day. It's just this this disciplined way of you wake up in the morning. We call it in India, it's like a riyaz. Riyaz is sort of a practice for music where you sort of all the tonations of your voice, and it's the same idea in architecture. So I think that was the single most sort of important aspect for me, is just the discipline of doing architecture every day. Drawing, sketching, making models, so on and so forth.
And as these interviews I'm doing have a lot to do also with the protest against forgetting, as Eric Hobsbawm called it. I'm very interested in some pioneers who might have influenced you. In previous interviews you mentioned Laurie Baker, so I was very curious to hear about Laurie Baker.
Laurie Baker in India is extremely influential because his whole process was the idea of building for the poor, and he developed a whole sort of method of construction, based on local materials, local architecture, but the act of building very dignified buildings for the extremely poor section of the country. And he played a great influence in a way that, taking something very simple and, bringing it dignity and making it special for the inhabitants. So Laurie Baker is sort of an important figure in terms of inspiration locally.
And in terms of India, are there any pioneers? I mean, there's obviously Doshi and Korea, very well-known pioneers. What about them? And are there other pioneers from India who inspired you?
Doshi and Korea are well known, but I think for me more important was an architect at that time called Manu Bhuta, who won a competition for the Gandhi Memorial, which was built in Delhi. But he built a few buildings, and I had the good fortune of being able to stay in some of these buildings. And I think it played a major role, especially in my growing up years when I was young, at the age of 9 and 10, to be able to experience these buildings. So I think somewhere that played an important role in sort of shaping the way I think of architecture, especially in India. Another important person, not directly in India, but based in Sri Lanka, is a well-known architect called Geoffrey Bawa.
Yeah, whom I knew because we had invited him to Cities on the Move towards the very end of his life, and he was obviously the great pioneer also of incredible gardens.
That's right, and for me the important relationship is the relationship between the architecture and the garden, or nature and architecture. And actually in India, being such a tropical country, the outside really takes precedence over the built form.